Of Blood and Steel, written by Seymour Zainali, narrated by James Lawrence. Chapter 17. The Battle at the Iron Gates. At dawn, Balak was on the wall when the siege started. He could see the entire battlefield. Lord Anzor stood with his back straight and a thin belt around his waist, armed with a lavish chestplate decorated with the shapes of poppy flowers. Bright and clean gambeson peeked through his armor. His sword handle was engraved with shiny jewels. The strong flat of the sword was engraved with an Amidan phrase, but Balak couldn't read it. It looked expensive, yet it was still a sword like any other, ready to spill blood. The men stood on top of the curtain wall, anticipating the Laverian army. They first saw the tops of the siege towers. They slid along a roadway made of flat wooden planks. The 4 siege towers moved slowly and clunkily on the uneven terrain. They were pulled by massive oxen in the front and pushed by a dozen strong men from behind. The towers looked heavy, and it was a miracle they didn't collapse under their own weight. Then came the trebuchets, followed by a battering ram. The soldiers lined up before their commander, who gave them a rousing speech. The cheering of men was heard all the way to the castle. They were chanting something in Laverian before the trebuchets fired. The men on the walls covered their heads with shields to avoid being hit. Decapitated limbs and the heads of the fallen rained down on the castle. Lesser experienced men appeared worried and scared. Some looked to Lord Anzor, who stood unshaken. He stared into the distance when the Laverian army rushed toward the castle walls. The battle had begun. As soon as the enemy was close enough, the High Commander gave the signal for the trebuchet behind the defensive walls to open fire on the enemy. The Laverian army was met with a slew of arrows and was further surprised with several large boulders. The Laverian men were crushed under the rocks. The first to reach the wall were the men with ladders. Balak and the soldiers to his right and left threw rocks at them. The ladders reached the curtain walls, and enemies began to climb them in hopes of overwhelming the defenders. Balak managed to throw off the ladders, dropping countless men with them to the ground. A few arrows whizzed by him, and one scratched his left cheek. The castle was centuries old, and it was built without a talus. The siege towers were still an effective tactical tool that needed to be destroyed. "Stop the towers!" the High Commander shouted. "Archers, shoot the oxen!" The commander raised his sword and signaled when to fire. Archers stood atop of the enemy siege towers and fired back at the soldiers on the wall. The bloodied oxen writhed on the ground, and the first siege tower stopped in its tracks. Balak watched as the second tower began to roll down the hill before hitting a rocky surface and collapsing, killing or injuring anyone on top of it. A large boulder flew over his head, hitting the side of the keep and falling to the ground, crushing the men who were under it. Arda was on the 3rd floor of the keep, and she could feel the place vibrate. Not knowing what was happening outside made her anxious. She paced the room, thinking of how she could contribute. She tried to peek out of the room, but the guards asked her to stay inside. Arda then saw a small gap between the rocks. Men were attempting to lift an enemy boulder that had hit the keep earlier. The soldiers tried to carry it to the castle's trebuchet and use it as a projectile, but their efforts were futile. Arda grabbed her spear and began to summon a spell. Her eyes glowed as she mimicked lifting the rock. She felt as though she were lifting it herself. The men couldn't believe it, but the rock felt lighter. They were able to carry it to the trebuchet and launch it over the defensive wall at the enemy. Arda fell to her knees when the rock was finally near the trebuchet. She looked at her shaking hands. Her muscles hurt like fire. She wrapped her arms around her lower back. She felt exhausted. Her skin turned pale, and she had the sudden urge to vomit. Meanwhile, Balak caught a glimpse of the battering ram rolling into the battlefield. Several men manned each side, and they began rolling it toward the gates. It was enormous.
"Aim for the battering ram," the head commander called to his archers. "Set it ablaze."
Archers and arbalests lit their arrows and aimed for the battering ram, but their attack had very little effect. Apart from a few arrows piercing its roof, it maintained its momentum. The ram had been dampened, making it more resistant to fire from the archers. The walls shook as the ram hit the gates, but it did not break through.
"Give those filthy pigs a warm bath,"
the head commander ordered. Boiling hot oil rushed through the murder holes at the top of the gatehouse. The men below screamed as they were coated in hot oil, and when the archers followed with arrow fire, the screams turned to shrieks and squeals. Balak watched as burnt men dropped to the ground, and others rushed up to take their place without hesitation. When the oil was gone, soldiers started to boil water and sand to burn their enemies below. Trebuchets bombarded the right and left towers of the castle. Boulder after boulder was fired at the weakest points in hope that it would collapse. The commander dashed along the walls.
"Ballistae, take down the trebuchets," he ordered.
The ballistae fired hard toward the trebuchets, but more arrows missed than hit. The trebuchets continued to pound the towers with extreme accuracy. The siege towers kept creeping in, and unlike the battering ram, they were not damp. The arrows reached the third tower, and the soldiers quickly tried to put out the fire. They did a fine job, but they could only do so much. After a few fiery arrows plunged into the top, middle, and bottom, the third siege tower finally started to burn. Balak witnessed several men jumping off the tower, breaking their legs as they landed.
"We need more arrows,"
shouted the head commander. His order was repeated down the chain of command, all the way to the squires in the bailey. They rushed to the curtain's wall, stumbling and falling, supplying archers and the rest with arrows.
"Faster, you worthless pieces of shit!"
shouted the head commander. The fourth and final tower wasn't slowing down. Its gangplank was already in reach. It dropped, and several men rushed out. Mostly volunteers, those men were sure to die. But if they survived, they would be handsomely rewarded with loot and promotions. Balak engaged in hand-to-hand combat, making sure none of them achieved their glory. The High Commander ordered the left towers to grapple the siege tower and push it on its side. They needed to do it fast, before the enemy could overwhelm the defenses. But the Laverian archers provided cover to their brothers in arms. Balak and the men on both of his sides held shields and pushed against the invading force, trying to buy as much time as they could. He could feel his feet sliding back as the enemy force kept coming. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed a nearby morning star and began hitting enemies on the head over his shield. Finally, the allied archers managed to grapple the siege tower and pushed it to its side. The remaining Laverians jumped off the wall to their deaths. The battle lasted long into the evening as the enemy's numbers began to dwindle. Balak could hear the soldiers cheer as the battle ended. He took a deep sigh of relief and leaned on the defensive wall. He saw a few men break into tears of joy, hugging each other and taunting the remaining Laverians who stood in the distance. But suddenly the castle shook, and the left tower crumbled, collapsing into itself, crashing to the ground and crushing the men on the bottom. A thick dust settled over the city, and silence fell on the land. There was a roar, and out of the woods a portion of the Laverian army that had been hidden in the forest charged toward the castle. The Amidon soldiers looked defeated. The High Commander looked at Anzor.
"My lord!"
Anzor's men were tired. They had fought since first daylight, but the battle wasn't over yet. Anzor unbuckled his elegant sword and walked down the stairs.
"That's it. We're all doomed," said one of the soldiers. "You most certainly will be if you stay here, or you can follow me and finish the battle. They want war. Let's give it to them. Come, let's secure our place in history."
Lord Anzor rallied his men and led them toward the battlefield.
"You heard the Lord. Don't drop your shields and swords just yet, ladies. Let's show these Laverian scum a warm Amida greeting," the head commander said.
"My hands are sore," pleaded a soldier leaning against the castle walls, barely lifting his shield.
"You can rest when you're dead,"
shouted the high commander.
"Now go out there and fight,"
he continued as he threw the man forward. Movement started as the dust cleared and the enemy appeared and started to spill into the city. Amidan's soldiers met Laverian soldiers, and they all clashed at the new opening. Balak rushed from the wall and into the battle. Body after body piled up as both swords and fists clashed. This was an advantage to the iron gates. Its fortified design bought them time while they waited for reinforcements. The bodies formed a wall, which made it difficult for the enemy to get into the castle, although not impossible. Balak was in the mix of the slaughter. His face was covered in spatters of blood. He killed soldier after soldier, going through them with his axe. He was pushed from behind mid-sprint and fell to the ground. He was still alive, but he could feel bodies piling up on his back. They were getting heavier and heavier, and he struggled to breathe. He was getting crushed under the weight when he finally noticed a small opening. He could hear cheering and footsteps pushing in the opposite direction as the Allied army arrived, so he pushed towards it and climbed through. He could see a sea of horsemen riding toward the battle, and for a few minutes he thought the battle could be won. The Laverian army changed formation, aiming their billhooks and war scythes at the incoming horsemen. What looked like 2,000 Amidan soldiers clashed in the middle of the open field. The numbers were closer to equal now, but not as many as he had been expecting. However, the enemy was drawn in the other direction, and even though they were unlikely to overcome the huge Laverian army, it was the chance the civilians needed to escape, as fewer enemies entered the inner bailey. Balak saw some civilians breaking out through gaps and heading toward the mountain path, dropping their luxury items. The soldiers helped them leave, but not everyone was leaving. In the distance, Balak watched as the assassin who was searching for Arda entered the inner bailey. Balak knew he had to find her before the assassin did. He rushed to Arda's room, passing the royal guards before entering in a hurry. He saw Arda standing still and rushing toward her.
"Arda, we must go. The assassin is back."
But Arda stood without moving. Balak reached her and turned her around, but she was faceless. It caught Balak by surprise, and he fell onto his arse. A faceless figure of Arda stood motionless before him, joined by a figure resembling himself.
"Balak!"
Arda explained.
"What the fuck is that thing?"
"Husks. I thought you were the assassin."
"Why don't they have a face?"
"This is only my third time."
"We should leave. The assassin is on his way,"
Balak said, opening the door. As he did, he saw the assassin approaching across the long hallway. He swiftly went back in and locked the door.
"Fuck! He's already here. We must leave, now."
"How? This is the only exit." Balak looked through the window and tried to determine if they could jump. "Wait, I have an idea," Arda proclaimed, turning as she looked at the two husks. Balak nodded in response. He heard metal clashing and said,
"Make it quick."
He stood and watched as Arda conjured a spell and the two husks passed through the wall. Balak grew impatient as the sounds grew louder, but he said nothing. He knew that Arda needed to concentrate. Her eyes began to glow, and she stood still in complete silence, holding the child. Balak heard the assassin easily disarming the guards behind the door. He stood ready to protect her and the child when the sounds stopped. The footsteps dissolved in the distance. Arda blinked, and her eyes returned to normal again. It worked.
Great. This will keep him occupied for a while.
Wait, she exclaimed. I still have to control them. Her eyes began to glow again, and she went back into a trance.
Fine,
Balak groaned. Balak strapped the child to his chest, covered Arda's eyes, and lifted her. He carried her down the keep. He carefully snuck in the shadows to avoid being seen. Balak heard screams echoing in the hallway. Finally, he made it to the outer walls when Arda snapped out of her trance. She was gasping for air and grabbing her stomach.
What's wrong?
Balak tried to calm Arda down. He stabbed me. I was bleeding, she panted.
Where is he?
Over Balak's shoulder, Arda watched the top of the keep's tower. Balak looked in the same direction, and they saw the assassins staring at them, empty-handed.
We should move,
Balak suggested. They vanished into the crowd and pushed their way through the narrow path. Arda was shaking from the cold. Balak pulled his black furs over her maroon cloak and fastened them. As they made it to higher ground, Balak glanced back at the iron gates. The gates stood strong, but the walls crumbled. The enemy had made it past the walls, and black smoke billowed from the outer bailey and the keep. The screams continued to echo as fire rampaged through the castle. They witnessed civilians, unarmed, being struck down with swords. Women were thrown to the ground, and soldiers climbed on top of them. The murdering and pillaging continued even when men and women offered their surrender. No life was spared. Shrieks and blood-curdling screams echoed through the valley.
Let's go, Arda. There's nothing we can do now,
Balak said. Arda clutched her staff tightly. There was a rumble as the northern wall of the iron gates collapsed. By dusk, when the cloud of dust and smoke had settled, all that was left of a once impenetrable castle were its iron gates.